Since February 2022, many nations around the world have rushed to rearm, although not all of them at the same rate. Historically, or at least recently historically gun-shy Germany, is reportedly expected to dial up defence spending from less than 2% of GDP before the Russian invasion to 3.5% by 2029. Poland, perhaps feeling a bit too close to Belarus and Russia for comfort, has moved faster, going from 2.7% before to 4.2% now, with a target of 4.7% next year. And then there's Russia itself, which by CIPRI estimates has gone from spending about 3.6% in 2021 to 7.2% in 2025, at least across the categories that CIPRI counts. But there is a country out there that would look at those increases, at least in percentage terms, and basically say amateurs. Because the head of a regional arms race you may never have heard of is an African country of roughly 47 million people, in the midst of a buying spree that historically has covered everything from German frigates to Russian ballistic missiles, and now looks set to potentially cover everything from drones to new missiles to Africa's first fifth-generation fighters, in the form of the first claimed foreign acquisition of Russia's Sukhoi 57 Felon. And to pay for it all, using an economy that in nominal terms is about the size of Finland or Kentucky, the hydrocarbon-rich nation of Algeria has more than doubled its defence spending, from about 4% of GDP in 2022 to the better part of 9% in 2025. By those percentages, Algeria is now spending more on defence in peacetime than Russia is during wartime, and funding it by running a central government deficit that in percentage terms is worse than the French and American ones combined. And so today, for the first time on the channel, welcome to North Africa, as we zoom in on one of the best equipped and best funded militaries on the African continent, and what Algeria's surge in defence spending likely signals, not just about the future of the Algerian military and economy, but also the evolving strategic balance in a deeply significant region. To do that, I'll work through a couple of sections in sequence. I'll start with some history and strategic and economic context, then get into the Algerian military as it exists today, and what we know both about the surge in the defence budget and what the Algerian military is likely looking to spend that on. Then we'll zoom out a bit, asking what that modernisation effort tells us about Algeria's strategic priorities, how some of its neighbours might be likely to respond, and also raise the question of economic sustainability. Because while Algeria is an energy-rich state with a growing economy and immense human capital, running what most nations would consider wartime budgets during peacetime is always going to come with trade-offs. But before we start digging into the economics, or what the Algerian military might look like at the end of this, let me welcome back a returning sponsor. In a time where world-shaping events can feel like a daily occurrence, there can be a real premium on making sure that when you're seeing news coverage of those events, that you're getting multiple relevant angles. If you looked at the coverage ahead of the Trump-Zelensky meeting, for example, this one would have given you the basics, that the meeting was happening. But others elevate a different context, like this one, noting both that meeting will follow on the back of a Trump phone call with Putin, and the expectation that Ukraine will be requesting supplies of Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States. The tool being used to flick between headlines here is long-term channel sponsor Ground News. By reportedly drawing on more than 50,000 news sources around the world, what it can allow you to do is quickly compare headlines, while also providing you some context for the organisations covering them. Think things like ownership information. Beyond that, Ground News can also help you get more awareness and control over how algorithms might control what news you see. For example, the blind spot feed might help to surface stories that don't receive a huge amount of coverage in the sources you normally look at, while the For You feed gives you the option to focus on the kind of topics and events that you're interested in. So you can potentially focus more of your time and energy on getting a fuller understanding of the topics that interest you, rather than having to wait and filter through the stuff you don't really care about first. As I've said in the past, some of those major challenges of the modern information environment, from echo chambers to the influence of algorithms, are not the kind of things that any single tool is going to be able to entirely solve. But I don't think that's a good reason for us not to try. I'm happy to have Ground News in my toolkit, and there's a reason they're this channel's longest running sponsor. And so if you're interested, there will be a link in the description that'll give you access to a 40% discount on a Ground News Vantage plan, which is the one I use. And so with my thanks to Ground News as always, let's get back to it. So, welcome to Algeria. In geographic terms, this is Africa's largest nation, at a casual 2.38 million square kilometres, 920,000 square miles, or a bit less than a third of an Australia, depending on what kind of units you like to use. The distribution of the approximately 47 million people who live there, however, is very much weighted towards the coast, meaning in many cases the very long borders Algeria shares with its neighbours are going to be relatively sparsely populated. In strategic terms, I think it's fair to say Algeria exists in a rather interesting neighbourhood, with Tunisia and Libya to the east, Niger, Mali and Mauritania to the south, to the west places like Morocco, more about that one in a minute, and to the north you have the Mediterranean. In 2025, according to IMF figures, the nominal GDP was about $288 billion US, so roughly $6,100 per capita, While adjusted for purchasing power parity, it was closer to 874 billion, about 18,500 per person. In terms of what makes up that economy, Algeria is really well diversified. They have both oil and gas. More seriously, while there have been efforts to diversify, this is still very much a hydrocarbon-based economy, with, depending on how you count, oil and gas making up a majority of government revenues and more than 90% of the country's exports. A lot of those energy exports flow to Europe, not just by ship, but also by a number of different pipelines, with Italy in particular standing out as a major export partner for the country. Compared to some of the other countries we've looked at, a lot of the economic indicators in Algeria are somewhat more positive. Inflation has come down, and as tends to happen when you're in the energy export business, the government has a buffer of foreign exchange reserves to fall back on. That said, there are issues. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment levels running into the double digits, and deep government fiscal deficits that have to cover a range of things, from extensive subsidies to efforts to diversify the economy, and of course, the defence budget. The Algerian military and the budget behind it is a key focus of this episode. But in order to help understand the context that generated that force and the strategic context we currently see, I do think we need a little bit of history here. Although in doing that, I need to include a caveat up front. I am not, and never have been, a Middle East or North Africa expert. The overwhelming majority of my work and background has tended to focus either on Europe or parts of Asia. And so while this is an area of the world with a very long and rich history, I'm mostly going to be focused on small slices of it that directly inform the military strategic situation today. North Africa, including Algeria, has often been deeply intertwined with the history of the Mediterranean and strategic and economic relationships with European states that, let's just say, have varied significantly over time. For many years, for example, what historians refer to as the Kingdom of Numidia would be a powerful independent state and often Roman ally. But eventually it would decline. Much of its territory would be absorbed into Rome's African provinces, and to this day there are still a number of places in Algeria where you can see extensive Roman ruins. The kingdom would change hands between various kingdoms and caliphates, until by the 16th century the Regency of Algiers existed essentially as a semi-independent province or vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. This was one of the major powers along what many Europeans referred to as the Barbary Coast, derived from the word Berber. And I bring this period up to highlight that in military, economic and strategic terms, North Africa, including Algeria, had a key impact on the dynamics in the Mediterranean, particularly as many privateers or corsairs from the region became very adept at the naval entrepreneurial process of converting someone else's property into your property without the pesky step in the middle of having to pay for it. The corsairs would target ships, coastal areas, places like Corsica, while also being extremely active in what you could describe in YouTube-friendly terms as the human resources business. At times, another major source of revenue for the Regency of Algiers were various states essentially paying protection money. Realms could pay up and in exchange receive various privileges, perhaps lower custom duties or freedom of navigation, or reducing the rate at which your people tended to find themselves involuntarily recruited into the North African or interlinked labour markets. Famously, after the American Revolution, when the corsairs figured out that American vessels were no longer under the protection of the British Royal Navy, American merchant ships were not immune. The fact that in 1785 the US had disbanded the Continental Navy probably didn't help, and so in a way, Algiers can claim some credit in pushing the US Congress to establish the United States Navy in 1794. For years, though, to try and protect their boats, the new United States would be paying regular tribute to places like Algiers and Tripoli. At their highest, payments of ransoms and tributes actually amounted to a not insignificant share of total US government revenue. And in his election campaign, Thomas Jefferson would turn the whole thing into an election issue, suggesting the United States was being humiliated by paying a, quote, enormous tribute to the petty tyrant of Algiers, end quote. Over time, though, that economic model would start to wane as the naval and broader military capacity of the newly emerging United States and various European countries began to more and more heavily eclipse these North African powers. The US would fight a very brief war with the Regency of Algiers in 1815, which pretty definitively signalled that the piracy was going to stop, but so too were the protection payments. The leadership in Algiers would repudiate that agreement relatively soon after. By that stage, the writing was very much on the strategic wall. An Anglo-Dutch force would bombard Algiers in 1816 to force additional agreements, and less than 15 years later, the French had moved in to begin their conquest and colonisation of Algeria. The experience of Algeria under French colonial rule was different from many other areas, for one key reason. From a legal perspective, France came to regard Algeria not so much as a colony, but as an integral part of France itself. Immigrants from France and some other European states would settle in cities like Algiers and Oran in very significant numbers. And in part because of that legal and demographic status, in the age of decolonisation after the end of the Second World War, France would fight a particularly long, hard, brutal, and expensive war to try and hold on to Algeria. Estimates for the number of dead over the course of the Algerian War vary widely. But what isn't contested is that it was a hard and brutal affair that had a significant lasting impact on the Algerian state that emerged. Looking at Algerian history post-independence, there are a couple of elements that stand out as potentially shaping its strategic context today. The first is a legacy of very close ties with specific powers, especially Moscow. Algeria for much of the 20th century was an active supporter of the non-aligned movement, but the Soviet Union was often an absolutely critical economic backer and the supplier of the vast majority of the country's military equipment. And that defence equipment relationship has persisted well into the 21st century, with Algeria alongside India being one of the major buyers of Russian military equipment. What that very much doesn't mean, though, is that Algeria should simply be regarded as another country in the Russian column, so to speak. Algeria's strongest military relationship has long been with Moscow, with Beijing now growing in importance as well. But remember, the country's critical export earnings and a lot of its economic interactions are very much linked to Europe. And while Russia has long been happy to sell Algeria kit, the relationship in other areas has sometimes been a bit uneven. For example, Algeria had publicly pushed to join BRICS, but for various reasons, when a suite of new members were announced in 2023, Algeria wasn't one of them. More recently, Algeria, which is a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, boycotted a vote on a resolution that was generally seen as endorsing Algerian rival Morocco's plan for the future of the Western Sahara. More on that in a moment. And while Russia as a permanent member could have vetoed that resolution, they instead abstained, allowing it to pass with 11 votes in favour. The point is that while Algiers obviously has close ties to Moscow, it's not always black and white. The second element is that the government in Algiers has often faced what might be described as domestic security challenges. For example, there was a short rebellion in the early 60s, and then an extended brutal civil war that kicked off in the 1990s in what became known as the Black Decade. And I'd argue the circumstances of that civil war help highlight factor number 3, the central role the military and military figures have often played in Algerian politics. Newly independent Algeria's first president lasted less than 2 years in the role before being overthrown in a military coup. He was replaced by his former defence minister in a bloodless coup, who would rule the country between 1965 and his death in 1978. He would in turn be succeeded by another military officer who would serve as president until 1992. From 1994 to 1999, the president was once again a former general and former minister of defence. And when President Abdelaziz Bouteflika began his rule in 1999, which would last until 2019, he did so with a massive electoral victory and the backing of the military. A backing the military would later withdraw during massive nationwide protests in 2019, likely prompting the president to rapidly reconsider his plans for a 5th term, highlighting again the scale of the role that organisations like the military and intelligence services play in Algerian politics. Whether you're talking about ancient Rome or a modern state, if you exist in a system where the military can basically tap the leader on the shoulder and say, "Hey mate, I reckon it's time to go," there might be incentives for leaders to think twice before dialing back the military budget. The final piece of the strategic puzzle I want to look at then is the relationship between Algeria and Morocco. Although the word relationship might be a bit of a stretch, considering Algeria cut off diplomatic relations with Morocco back in 2021. This is the country to Algeria's west, and from Algiers' perspective, probably the country's prime regional rival. An overly glib observation here is that if as an observer you had no other information and saw something called the Algerian People's National Army, full of Russian equipment, lined up against the Royal Moroccan Army, full of American equipment, if you had nothing else to go on, you'd probably assume there might be some tension there. But the fissures obviously run much, much deeper than the two countries picking different sides in the Cold War era arms supply market. I plan to do a follow-up video on Morocco where I'll go into some of this in much greater detail, but for now, suffice to say, that Algeria would officially obtain its independence from France in 1962, and by September 1963, it was fighting what became known as the Sand War against Morocco. Against the backdrop of a dispute over post-colonial borders, Moroccan troops would cross into Algerian-controlled territory, although the war would ultimately end without any territorial changes. Those territorial disputes would eventually be closed out at the negotiating table much, much later, but it was hardly a fantastic start to the post-independence relationship. A more enduring tension point between the two countries has been the status of the area described as the Western Sahara. We'll go into more detail about this when we talk about Morocco, but for the moment the spark notes are that Morocco claims the region as part of their country, and while Algeria doesn't claim the region for themselves, they greatly dispute the Moroccan claim. It's generally assessed that Algeria has long been a supporter of the Polisario Front and its armed wing, whose stated goal is the creation of an independent Western Saharan state, and who fought a protracted insurgency first against the Spanish and then against the Moroccans. At time of recording, de facto control of this region was split, symbolised by a very almost Game of Thrones style solution. In the 1980s, the Moroccans constructed essentially a sandberm wall running about 2,700 kilometres, dividing the Moroccan-controlled west, approximately 70% of the territory, from the Polisario-controlled east. The recent UN Security Council resolution that Algeria boycotted has generally been seen as a win for the Moroccan position. So much so that Morocco actually declared a public holiday in order to celebrate it. To somewhat oversimplify, it appeared to endorse a proposal very similar to one Morocco put forward in 2007 for the region in its entirety to exist as an autonomous part of Morocco. And a number of major powers have subsequently voiced support for that model as the way forward. But UN resolutions are ultimately not magic and don't instantly change the situation on the ground. And a couple of days ago it was reported that Polisario forces had fired on Moroccan military personnel in the region. So while there may be political movement, the issue is far from closed. It's likely to remain a point of tension between Algeria and Morocco, and it's hardly the only one out there. Algeria, for example, has accused Morocco of backing separatists in their territory, and Algeria was hugely opposed to Morocco normalising its relationship with Israel. We could keep going through some other flashpoints, but by now you probably get the picture. The relationship between Algeria and Morocco has seldom been fantastic, to say the least, and that likely shapes the lens through which we should look at the Algerian military. It's a force that's likely to have to focus on different missions: internal stability and sometimes counterinsurgency at home, more traditional military competition with a peer but smaller competitor, Morocco, and also, implicitly, a political and social role, where you'd expect Algerian leaders to want to keep the military on side because of their demonstrated ability to shape who runs the country and until when. Stick all that context together, and from a political perspective, a surge of military investment might make sense. Which brings us to those massive increases we've seen since 2022. So before we even start to get into what Algeria is proposing to buy with that massive surge of defence cash, let's just set a bit of a baseline, looking at how the Algerian military looked as of Military Balance 2024, because as you'll see pretty quickly, starting with the ground component, especially by regional standards, this was already an extensively equipped force. Now, my goal here is to make sure that these sections don't just become a straight list of figures, it's always about what those numbers tell us. The army in total is about 110,000 active duty personnel, of whom 35,000 are regulars and the rest are conscripts doing their 1-year compulsory service. Then, in terms of formations, you have a couple of major divisions, 1st and 8th which are armoured, 12th and 14th which are mechanised and an airborne division, and then a number of separate brigades. Across the board, there's a significant park of heavy equipment, about 1,500 tanks, 1,000 IFEs, more than 1,000 APCs, about 180 multiple rocket launchers, and more than 600 pieces of tube artillery. And as we start to break some of those components up, it can tell us more about the overall force. If you look at the tank fleet, for example, it illustrates that in a lot of places, this is a multi-generation force. There's a bunch of newer equipment on one hand, and legacy stuff often left over from the Soviet era. In the tank fleet, the more modern side is represented by the T-90SA, which is also the most common type of vehicle in the fleet, and one where Algeria has some localised assembly and maintenance capabilities. What reportedly happened under a deal dating back to 2014, for example, is the Russians sent basically knockdown kits, so parts kits for tanks to Algeria, where they were locally assembled. Those tend to be the backbone of Algeria's actual tank formations. Then in the middle, you have modernised T-72s, a bit over 300 of them, and then at the other end of the spectrum, at a very different capability level than the T-90SA, you have about 270 T-55 AMVs. You can see an example on the right there, showing off the vehicle with a tank to ERA ratio that wouldn't be out of place in Ukraine. At first glance, you might be surprised to see T-55s appearing on a list of equipment for a country I generally described as fairly well equipped for the region it's operating in, especially if I tell you that Military Balance used to list a bunch of T-62s in the Algerian inventory as well, which have now disappeared while the T-55s remained. But in Algerian service, the T-55 tends to fill a slightly different role to the more modern T-90s. A lot of them, for example, aren't in the armoured units, they're in the motorised infantry formations, basically filling a bit of a mobile protected fires or assault gun role in order to support those infantry. Remember that while we call it a main battle tank, and it certainly was at the time it was introduced, T-55 is in roughly the same weight range as the Chinese Type 15 light tank and whatever the American M10 Booker was. So maybe not a light tank, but definitely a tank that's light. Plus, courtesy of their upgrades, the Algerian versions can also fire the Ukrainian Stugna anti-tank guided missile from the main gun. Despite that niche and the modernisations though, at the end of the day it's still a T-55. It still has design DNA dating back to the Stalin era, and if the Algerian military were ever to complete the modernisation of the other half of the tank fleet, these would probably go. Another observation is that Algeria is often a very keen buyer of some of the more specialised, urban warfare-centric Russian designs, which often don't get picked up even by traditional buyers of Russian military equipment. I think that's illustrated both by the fact that Algeria bought the TOS-1A, which is the short-range thermobaric multiple rocket launcher, which we've seen can be both very devastating but also very vulnerable in a Ukrainian context because, while it has a lot of firepower, it tends to explode if a drone so much as tickles it, and they have to get relatively close to the front line to fire. And also, in one of its more interesting purchases, Algeria is also a buyer of the BMPT Terminator, basically a combination of a dual autocannon, ATGM and grenade-launching remote weapon station on top of a tank hull that hasn't had the most distinguished performance in Russian service. The Algerian army, however, does seem to be pretty positive about this whole tank chassis, autocannon, fire support vehicle arrangement, while also coming up with what you might describe as their own twist on the concept, an Algerian BMPT, if you will. The thing you see on the right there is sometimes referred to as the BMPT 62, and it's an answer to part of the mystery of where all those Algerian T-62s be at. The basic gist here is you take a T-62, rip the turret and 115mm gun off it, and then add the upgraded BMP-2 Berejok turret in its place. That gives you a fire support vehicle with a 30mm cannon, an automatic grenade launcher, and a quad pack of anti-tank guided missiles. While it might not make sense for a lot of countries, if you are Algeria and clearly put a lot of emphasis on these closer range fire support vehicles, and you happen to have a bunch of retired T-62 hulls sitting around, this might be a relatively elegant solution. You're using something you already have, combined with something you already understand, in order to produce a vehicle that's closer to what you want. You're getting that 30mm cannon and ATGMs you might otherwise get with the BMP-2, but courtesy of the swap to an armoured T-62 hull, you now have a level of armour protection that might actually survive being shot at with a 50 cal or being hit with a stiff breeze. Another creative Algerian use of old T-62 hulls is the vehicle you can see on screen here, which is a combat engineering conversion where what they've done is essentially add an armoured box on top of the chassis, equipped with what appears to be a forward-facing machine gun, and 2 line charge launchers for clearing obstacles or minefields. Now, in an ideal world, would you prefer to have a purpose-built vehicle for that role? Possibly. But the Algerians already had the T-62s, and I think this vehicle and the previous one demonstrates the way the Algerian military will often try and leverage what it already has. Another theme that comes through in the equipment is diversification, sometimes in strange places that you might not expect given that, for the most part, Algeria has bought a lot of its military equipment from the Soviet Union or Russia. The most important vehicle in the APC fleet, for example, is actually the German Fox. As of 2023, the Algerians had something like 600 of these in service, with more arriving all the time, and reportedly were able to cut a deal with Rheinmetall to set up a degree of local Algerian production on the condition they wouldn't be resold into the wider market. This isn't the last time we're going to see European equipment operating alongside Russian or Chinese offerings, but I can imagine for observers who aren't properly pre-briefed, seeing a line of T-90s and BMPs rolling, only to be followed by German armoured personnel carriers, might potentially be a bit of a what the fooks moment. There's another section I want to bring up, not just to illustrate the fact that some militaries like big guns and they cannot lie, and Algeria definitely falls into that particular column, but also that trend towards diversification. In the tank fleet, the distinction is basically between new Russian and old Soviet equipment. With the AFEs, so the IFEs and APCs, it's between Russian and European equipment. With the artillery, the dividing line is instead between Russian and Chinese. The multiple rocket launchers, for example, are split between the likes of BM-21s and BM-30s from the Soviet Union and SR-5s from China. The more than 600 cannon artillery pieces, which is a lot for an army this size, is mostly made up of old, in some cases extraordinarily old, Soviet-era 122 and 152mm guns. On paper, there are a significant number of pieces belonging to 1930s designs, for example, but there are also more than 70 much more modern Chinese-built 155mm guns. And then you have pieces that sit somewhere in the middle, old toed Soviet D-30s, which the Algerians have given something of an upgrade treatment by essentially sticking them on the back of a Mercedes-Benz truck to create a basic SPG. The air defense component, again, is very extensive for a military the size, with primarily Russian and Soviet equipment. The Algerians operate significant quantities of some of the usual suspects: S-300, Buk, Tor, Osa, Strela. But the two big observations here are probably that both A, the government places a lot of emphasis on air defense, which is probably more consistent with the concern about potential state-on-state warfare than the likes of counterinsurgency, and also that Algiers has often done what it can to make sure it's getting access to the latest and greatest. At one point, for example, an upgraded version of the Pantsir made it to Algeria before it had entered service in Russia itself. And not only has Algeria already shown off S-400 air defense systems, although those were unveiled after Military Balance 2024 came out, it's been suggested that Algiers is interested in acquiring additional units. and might, alongside India, be a potential recipient if Moscow ultimately decides to buy S-400 systems back from Turkey. Algeria is also a member of the relatively small group of countries globally that have access to an inventory of relatively modern TBMs, tactical ballistic missiles. The numbers here are highly uncertain. Military Balance and SIPRI estimate at least 12 launchers and 75 missiles for the export version of Russia's Iskander system. According to the Russians, the export version is broadly equivalent to the one operated by the Russian military normally, with the one difference being a reduction in range to about 280 kilometres. The existence of the Iskanders is interesting to me for at least two reasons. Firstly, it implies that at least on some scale, Algeria is able to pick targets up to 280 kilometres away from its own borders, strike them relatively precisely, and do it in a way that's difficult for most air defence systems to counter. They may not be a huge amount of use in most counterinsurgency scenarios, and if you are an insurgent and find yourself being hit by an Iskander missile, then perhaps you should take it as a compliment, as it implies the Algerian government is willing to spend several $1 million worth of missile just for a chance to take you off the board. But it is something a better equipped state actor might have to remain aware of. The other element, which I think flows through a lot of the other analysis we have to do, is the fact the Algerians were able to keep these things out of public view for many, many years. According to organisations like SIPRI that try and track these things, it's generally believed the Algerians ordered these missiles back around 2013. The likely delivery date was somewhere around 2017, and yet we didn't see them on video until 2024, when the Algerian military finally decided to roll out some of the launches for the November 2024 Independence Day parade. In the modern world, countries hiding advanced capabilities and platforms is not an easy feat. There are relatively few countries with the kind of information control and other context necessary to sometimes pull it off. But given our experience with some of Algeria's systems, its Iskanders, its S-400s, it might be reasonable to assume that at any given time, the cards we're seeing aren't necessarily the entirety of Algiers' hand. With that same logic also applying to another missile in the Algerian inventory, the Chinese YJ-12, which is primarily a coastal defence anti-ship missile that Algeria possesses in at least some quantity, but with the exact numbers involved varying between sources. And while the army is clearly Algeria's first force, at least in terms of personnel count, there's also a reasonably well-equipped navy. On paper, the navy has about 15,000 personnel, and you can think of the force as being broadly split up into three components: the attack subs, a surface combat fleet, and a small amphibious warfare capability. In terms of the attack subs, the Algerians have 6 diesel-electrics, so quantitatively that puts them between Canada with 4 and Italy with 8. But when it comes to the composition of that Algerian fleet, there's a pretty stark dividing line when it comes to age and quality. At the core of it, all 6 of them are Kilo-class boats, but the 2 oldest ones were commissioned in the 1980s, literally built in the Soviet Union, and they had to go through refits in the 90s and 2000s. But even with those refits, you're still talking about hulls that relatively soon will be hitting 40 years of service. The remaining 4 boats are much improved versions of the Kilo class and were ordered in 2 pairs, commissioned in 2010 to 2011, and another pair in 2019. So much newer, much more capable. And importantly, other than just being quiet and relatively dangerous underwater combatants, as the improved Kilos are, they're also believed to have the capability to fire torpedo tube-launched Club S cruise missiles, a capability the Algerians have shown off. Which means, hypothetically, Algeria is one of those countries that has at least some capability to reach out and strike targets well beyond its own borders. In terms of the surface fleet, there are a trio of older Kony-class ships from the Soviet Union that I'm mostly going to leave out here because they don't really have the armament necessary to do most modern warship things, which leaves the Algerian Navy with 5 real principal surface combatants from 2 major suppliers. The larger of the 2 types is actually a pair of frigates from Germany. These were commissioned between 2016 and 2018, and to show off even more diversification, they've got a relatively interesting armament suite. The anti-ship missiles, for example, are 2 8-packs of Saab RBS-15s from Sweden, while the air defence missile system and the interceptors it fires is actually South African. The other vessels are 3 Chinese C-28s, each can fire 8 C-802 cruise missiles, but again, the Algerians insisted on a degree of diversification and customisation. The short-range air defence missiles, for example, are still Chinese, but they stuck a European radar on it. The missile power of those frigates and corvettes is also augmented by some smaller missile launching boats. That includes 1 more modern and 4 domestically built ships, all firing the Chinese C-802, a trio of old Nanuchka-class corvettes, each carrying 16 KH-35s, as well as a number of even smaller Soviet-era OSA-2 missile boats. Those date back to the 1970s, but fundamentally with the OSA, all you really needed was a floating metal platform that you could put a missile box launcher on, and they still succeed in being that. The Navy's patrol boats are a mixture of UK, French, Spanish, and locally built designs, but they're not heavily armed, and so they don't really have a place in this analysis. What does deserve a place is Algeria's amphibious warfare capability, which, to be fair, is about as compact as you can make an expeditionary amphibious capability and get away with it, but it's there. On paper, Algeria has about 7,000 naval infantry, and then a single LHD, which is a San Giorgio-class ship originally ordered from Italy and entering service in 2015, and then a pair of smaller, older vessels that date back to the 1980s. The San Giorgio can operate multiple helicopters at a given time and carry about 15 main battle tanks and 350 troops, while the smaller ships are good for about 7 tanks and 240 troops each. So realistically, there's enough capacity on paper here for Algeria to, for example, land a battalion of naval infantry with supporting heavy equipment, which isn't exactly the scale of force that's going to storm the beaches of Normandy, but still interesting, especially by regional standards. And then we have the Air Force, where Algeria has made and is looking to continue making some of its more interesting acquisitions. With about 14,000 personnel, the Algerian Air Force is the least manpower-intensive of 3 services, which is fairly normal by global standards. Air forces tend to be capital rather than manpower-intensive. Its mainline strength, its fighter force, in many ways has parallels to the Algerian tank fleet. Its equipment is overwhelmingly from one supplier, Moscow, relatively numerous by regional standards, and divided very roughly into the modernised and not modernised components. The country's more than 30 Sukhoi 24s, for example, are going to be fairly old airframes, even in cases where they've been subsequently upgraded. But the oldest of Algeria's mainline fighter, the Sukhoi 30 MKA, first entered service in 2007, with many examples being much, much newer than that. We've talked about the Sukhoi 30 MK before in its MKI variant, which is the one operated by the Indian Air Force, and the Algerian derivative does owe a bit to the Indian version. At its core, what you're looking at is a heavily upgraded 2-seat version of the Sukhoi 27. And when it comes to quality, I think the MKA is a clear example of how contextual that can be. In some of my previous videos, I've been a bit cool on some Russian flankers and flanker derivatives, but a lot of the critique there is just in relative terms that don't really apply in Algeria. Unlike a Russian flanker, an Algerian one is probably unlikely to be facing off against the likes of F-35s and F-22s backed by AWACS and other enablers, or upgraded 4th-generation designs like Eurofighter and Rafale that might be equipped with the air combat cheat code known as the Meteor missile. They're also not operating in Asia, where they might be compared to a host of Chinese designs like J-20, which gives the PLAAF a stealthier heavy fighter with a massive AESA radar, and a long-range missile in the form of the PL-15 that can really capitalise on high-performance sensors. North Africa, though, isn't the Diamond League of air combat technology. Algeria has about 60 Sukhoi 30s backed by a smaller fleet of MiG-29s, while the rival Royal Moroccan Air Force has very roughly 70 fighters total, split relatively evenly between F-16s, old F-1 Mirages, and Northrop F-5s. So by regional standards, those Sukhoi 30s are going to be very dangerous assets. All the more so because, unlike a lot of other air forces out there, Algeria also has an air refueling capability to support its fighters. With 6 Aleutian 78 tankers, Algeria is actually better equipped in that regard than some of the more major European militaries. And while Algeria can't reasonably expect to benefit from American air refueling capabilities the way many of the NATO allies can, even just 6 tankers means it has a sovereign ability to project at least some air power much further away from their bases than you might expect. That theme of surprising degree of power projection capability continues if you look at the airlift component, which is a combination of 11 heavy transports, Aleutian 76s, 18 medium transports, overwhelmingly American C-130s, because everyone who can get away with it buys the C-130, and then a very large collection of transport helicopters and light transport aircraft, giving the Algerian military at least some ability to move more rapidly across that very large national territory. The final aviation element to draw attention to is Algeria's fairly large attack helicopter force. The MB 2024 number was at least 72, divided between 30 older Mi-24s and 42 plus newer Mi-28s. You'll know I've expressed nervousness in the past about the future of the attack helicopter as an investment priority for a lot of forces out there, but Algeria again is a different context. Attack helicopters can cover a lot of territory quickly, operate from forward bases in relatively austere conditions, carry a lot of firepower and potentially do some heavy lifting, especially in that counterinsurgency role. The Mi-28, sometimes referred to as night hunters, are particularly notable in that regard because, as the name suggests, they can operate at night. And while yes, a lot of modern conventional opponents are going to be equipped with stuff that might pose a great threat to the attack helicopter, like advanced short-range air defence systems, man pads and night vision equipment, as well as newer things like interceptor drones, none of those are things you'd associate with most insurgent forces. So at least for the moment, it's relatively easy to see where these things might fit in terms of the overall Algerian strategy and force design. Now, I'm aware I've just spent a chunk of time throwing a bunch of numbers and platforms out there, but there is a reason why. What I'm trying to illustrate is that even before these latest budget increases, the Algerian military, by regional North African standards, was a very serious, well-equipped force with a lot of teeth. And despite the comparative modernity of a lot of the kit, the relative numbers involved weren't small either. Expressed another way, if you compared the Algerian military inventory to a lot of NATO countries, Algeria would come out looking relatively good. Relatively high investment levels, a lot of relevant platforms, some power projection and long-range strike capability, less reliance on America to provide all of the enablers, etc. My impression, from a deterrence and internal security perspective, was that what the Algerian military had was probably good enough, and that what you might expect to see is continuous, steady modernisation, broadly in line with the existing budget, rather than any sort of radical overhaul. Some of that spending power would have been steadily eaten away by inflation. $10 billion 2013 US dollars isn't the same as $10 billion 2022 dollars, as many of us are well aware. And so if the goal was just to maintain military budget buying power, what you might have expected to see was a steady ramp up once oil prices edged up and economic conditions allowed. What we instead saw as hydrocarbon revenue started to surge was a rough doubling to about $18 billion. Then more than $21 billion in 2024, crossing the $25 billion threshold in 2025. And based on the forward budget estimates that the Algerian government has released so far, there's no expectation that number will start to come back down. That ramp up in funding, about $16 billion US dollars per annum over the course of just 3 years, would be significant enough if you counted it just in nominal terms, raw US dollars. But as we know from our videos on countries like Ukraine, Russia and China, when it comes to defence spending, you can't really do that. Because while a dollar or a ruble might always be a dollar or a ruble on the international arms market, when it comes to a lot of the things that militaries need domestically, specifically personnel, services, land, stuff like that, purchasing power parity matters. I don't have a specific military purchasing power multiplier for Algeria from my usual source, but if we look at the general civilian economy as a whole, the multiplier is somewhere around 3 to 1. In purchasing power parity terms then, that sizes the overall Algerian economy at about $821 billion, which puts it above Ukraine but behind Romania. If you try to figure out what the exact multiplier would be for the military, there are different factors pulling in both directions. On one hand, this is a conscription military. A lot of the personnel are there for doing their 1-year national service, and generally speaking, nations that are able to fill the ranks with the voluntold have lower per unit personnel costs than others. On the other hand, a lot of Algeria's military equipment is imported, and purchasing power parity does not matter when you start interacting with the international market. If you did use that 3 to 1 multiplier, similar to a country like Brazil, you'd end up with an adjusted defence budget of about $75 billion US dollars equivalent. That would give the Algerian defence budget more buying power than the likes of Italy or Poland, although still behind countries like the UK and France. Which is a long way of saying that $25 billion US dollars in any environment is a fair amount of defence spending. And in a country like Algeria, it's an absolute shit ton of defence spending. But trying to assess what that massive surge is actually likely to do to the Algerian military is hard to assess, for at least 2 reasons. The first is that due to the linear nature of time, investment tends to precede capability. A country has to put up the money first, and then it takes time to convert that cash into equipment or an enlarged force structure. Because most of this funding is still very recent, we haven't seen it transmute into metal just yet. And trying to figure out what metal will ultimately appear is somewhat difficult because the Algerian government doesn't exactly publish a shopping list. In terms of defence budget transparency, countries operate on a spectrum. Some will tell you exactly how many bullets they're buying, others will deliver you a bullet at high velocity if you ask too many questions. Algeria isn't at either of those 2 extremes, but it is closer to one end than the other. One index of defence budget transparency I often see on the professional side ranks countries on a 0 to 100 scale, with 100 being the theoretical maximum level of transparency and 0 being the lowest. On that scale, Algeria gets a 20 out of 100. Algiers basically just gives us the headline figure, and from there, it's a bunch of detective and guesswork. Meaning that while I'm about to try and outline where some of this money might be going, please note that I might not have the entire story, and everything I say here could potentially be wrong. Caveats in place. What might be going on here? The first thing to say at a very high level is that we might be looking at a second equipment modernisation wave, if you will. You'll remember as I was going through a lot of those equipment parks, modernisation appeared to be a partially complete project. But a lot of what is there dates back to a previous surge in funding that we saw approximately between 2005 and 2015. During those years, admittedly from a much lower baseline, we saw Algeria roughly double its nominal defence spending between 2005 and 2010. Overall, defence spending as a percentage of GDP roughly doubled between 2005 and 2014, and that presumably helped create the fiscal space for a lot of the upgrades and acquisitions we saw. With us again seeing a more than doubling now in US dollar terms, I'd suspect that some major acquisitions are on the horizon. Near the top of the list in terms of public attention are Algeria's rumoured Airforce modernisation plans, with the top of the list being the claimed purchase of Russia's Sukhoi 57 Felon. This would be a first in a huge number of ways. the first export success of the Sukhoi 57 anywhere, and assuming you're happy with the classification, the first fifth-generation fighters operated by any African Air Force, and Algeria, one of the first countries after the People's Republic of China to adopt a fifth-generation fighter not called F-35. This potential acquisition has long been rumoured, but evidence has grown in recent years that both sides are serious about trying to make it happen. In 2024, the CEO of Russia's Defence Export Agency basically announced that, quote, "We already have the first signed contract for the Sukhoi 57E aircraft," end quote. While Algerian media has reported that the country is the first export customer for the fighter and that Algerian pilots are already undergoing training. In terms of delivery timelines, earlier this year, Algerian media suggested late 2025, although the window to make that deadline is obviously closing, and it hasn't been the simplest year for Russia's aircraft manufacturers. Now, there is a twist on this story. Back in October, a hacking group released what it claimed were Rostec internal documents. They appeared to point, like some other sources, towards an Algerian purchase of 12 Sukhoi 57s, along with 14 of Russia's Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers with supporting munitions and electronic warfare equipment. Then there's the story of Algeria's apparent Sukhoi 35s, which on the capability spectrum would sit between the 30 and the 57. These don't show up in the force list I showed you earlier because of the age of that dataset, but we're pretty confident at least some of them exist. The story here appears to go back to a number of Sukhoi 35s that were manufactured by the Russians, originally for sale to Egypt. Egypt later cancelled that deal, however, leaving a number of airframes without a final home to go to. For a while, it seemed like at least some of those fighters might end up going to an Iranian air force that desperately needed them. And in 2023, Iran's mission to the UN announced that a deal had been struck for the delivery of Sukhoi 35 fighters. But as best we can tell, no delivery ever took place. And instead, earlier this year, commercial satellite imagery captured an image of a Sukhoi 35 in Algeria wearing an Algerian Air Force roundel. Well, this image taken of Russia in April appears to show 4 additional fighters, again with Algerian markings. What that appears to indicate is Algeria moving towards a more diverse fighter fleet, going from a mix of MiG-29s and Su-30s to potentially MiG-29s, Su-30s, Su-35s and Sukhoi 57s. Russian media has claimed that just the purchase of those 12 57s is expected to set Algeria back something like $2 billion. If true, that would imply both that Russia isn't exactly giving Algiers mates rates on this one, pricing the felon in the same range as many Western jets, and also that one line item alone could take a significant chunk out of the procurement budget in any given year. If all of those rumoured purchases were actually to eventuate, it would represent a major shift in the Algerian air fleet. The Sukhoi 30s would go from being the sharp edge of the force to more of the mid-tier option, with the 57s presumably taking on the tip of the spear role, with the Sukhoi 34s potentially providing a much more modern replacement for some of the ageing 24s. A massive question around all of this, though, is likely Russia's ability to deliver these platforms and on what timelines. There is no doubt that Russian industry is currently producing all 3 aircraft types in question, new 35s, new 34s, new 57s. But they're not exactly drowning in them, and the VKS has its own very pressing requirements. Between combat and constructive losses, most foreign estimates I've seen suggest the Russian VKS now has fewer combat-ready airframes than it did in 2022. And with a lot of Russia's on-paper fighter strength still made up of much older platforms, I'd argue the strategic trade-off here is a pretty direct one. Unlike cases like India, where a significant degree of production is localised, a fighter Russia chooses to send to Algeria is a fighter that can't be sent to the VKS. And so in the coming months and years, it'll be interesting to see what Russia chooses to prioritise there. Keeping that valuable Algerian market alive and earning some export value in the process, or maximising the supply of new airframes to a force that's starting to show the strain after nearly 4 years of war. The other unknown, if these acquisitions progress, is how other powers in the region might respond. A relatively extreme hypothetical there that's had some rumours attached to it would be something like Morocco pursuing the purchase of F-35. Despite the chatter, that's the kind of example which would require a policy shift in Washington, an economic stretch by Morocco and its defence budget, which, if it were to happen, would result in a very different regional balance than a world where Algerian felons were still facing off against the likes of F-16. It would also set up North Africa as a potential arena for a Sukhoi 57 F-35 face-off, which probably wouldn't have been at the top of too many people's betting cards if you'd asked 15 years ago. That said, the potential timelines there are long, and the list of uncertainties tall. But I bring it up to highlight the way that sometimes spending big on military modernisation can be a bit of an action-reaction scenario. All else being equal, you'd expect that if the Moroccan government was on the fence about potentially putting up the money for something like F-35, hearing that their absolute best mates, the Algerians, might be getting their hands on some Russian 5th gens, might be the kind of thing that could shift the balance on the decision. Here's the thing, though, which comes back to the opacity of the situation we're dealing with. While a lot of the attention focuses on these potential air fleet modernisations, The reality is, the amount of extra money that Algeria has said they're pouring into the defence budget is higher than I would expect it to be if these were the only things on the table. It's just basic math that you'll struggle to fill a $15 billion a year funding surge with a handful of single-digit billion procurements. So what's potentially going on here? Noting that while it's impossible to prove, observers have generally suggested a couple of possible factors that are probably working together. For one, the other services are likely to receive modernisation attention as well. Continued focus on air defence and unmanned systems, as well as carrying on with the modernisation of half-refreshed sections of the force, like the armour and artillery, and potentially further platform acquisitions for the Navy. Then we might see a bunch of stuff that wouldn't normally turn up in SIPRI tracking. Investments in military bases and infrastructure, additional purchases of ammunition, munitions and basic consumables, additional spending on personnel or force enlargement, as well as more equipment diversification and investment in local production and modernisation capabilities, as well as funds that might be expended, shall we say, making sure that the political and military leadership remain aligned. We could go through other potential items. Algeria has a significant paramilitary force, for example. The Algerian press has openly discussed the possibility of importing Russian drones and loitering munitions. And Algeria's president has talked about the priority of increasing the country's military and civilian satellite network. But instead, I think it's worth zooming out for a bit of a bigger picture here. What, in high-level terms, do we know about this spending, and what does it potentially tell us? The first thing I'll say is that while we have nowhere near a complete picture, the high-profile purchases that we are seeing claimed or reported tend to be focused more on conventional warfighting and deterrence than they are on internal security or border patrol. If you're worried about chasing down insurgents, your first priority usually isn't going to be a modernised navy or air defence radars, and around the world, border patrols don't tend to cruise around in fifth-generation fighters, at least not yet. The general trend of what we've seen reported so far, which does tend to be skewed by what's interesting and high profile, would generally be more relevant if you were concerned about the overall military balance in the region, or the balance vis-a-vis Morocco, or even softer factors like perceived military prestige, than they would things like stability and counterinsurgency operations. A number of the purchases we've seen also suggest a willingness to make some very specific strategic trade-offs. Algeria is willing to pay the international diplomatic tax when it comes to its relationships with Europe and the United States by continuing to buy Russian equipment, for example, and in so doing, also potentially leaving itself open to delivery disruptions caused by the war in Ukraine and sanctions. But at the same time, it appears to be willing to pay the economic premium necessary to diversify its suppliers. Although even as more Chinese and European military equipment has made its way into the force, the overwhelming majority of what's there remains Russian or Soviet. A final observation I'd make then is the remaining question mark around the urgency here, the why. This is the kind of jump in investment you'd normally associate either with a major geopolitical crisis or the end of something like a peace dividend, a protracted period of depressed military spending. In Algeria's case, the drive is a bit more murky. There are places where the Algerian security situation has arguably deteriorated. We've talked a lot about the Algerian relationship with Morocco, but the security situation on some of its other borders isn't all sunshine and rainbows. In April, for example, Algeria shot down a Turkish-built Malian drone, which it claimed had crossed into its airspace. Mali disputed that characterization and initiated a case at the ICJ. So if you look just at the Algerian security situation and the way it's changed, for example, since 2020, you might reasonably conclude that, yeah, some additional investment might be merited. But the scale of the ramp-up relative to the size of Algeria's overall economy is in some ways hard to get your head around. And I think from a defence economics perspective, when you see a ramp-up like this, one of the natural questions to ask about the arms race participants involved is whether the countries can actually afford this. I think it's fair to say that in the old Cold War struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States, the answer ultimately was no. But what about Algeria and its move to basically wartime spending levels in a period of peace? Now remember, this isn't the only period of rapid defence spending increases by Algeria. There were those massive increases between 2005 and 2014 that I'd argue didn't suddenly just stop because of a change in policy, but because a massive economic speed bump got put in the way. Algeria, economically at least, is a hydrocarbon state, and 2014-15 was not a great time to be one of those. Around that time, the country needed a price of about $120 a barrel in order to break even on its budget. The budget it actually wrote assumed a price of $90, and they were getting around $60. What that meant is, especially against the backdrop of high inflation at the time, defence spending in real terms kind of flatlined, but in proportional terms it was still growing. Over the course of roughly 2016 through 2019, what often happened is that you would see government expenditure in general cut, in some cases fairly severely, while the military budget would be reduced by less, held static, or in some cases even increased slightly. Basically, what was happening during this low oil price era was the government was working desperately to try and protect defence spending while it was being gnawed away at by inflation, even if that meant having to sacrifice other government programs or accepting higher debt levels. Just from the outside looking in, a relatively static defence budget in US dollar terms might not look like a defence-first policy. But if you look under the hood of that period, I'd argue defence was being treated far, far better than other parts of state activity. Then in February 2022, there was this obscure geopolitical event, you might have heard of it, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which pretty quickly turned into a line go down moment for Russian military prestige, but a massive line go up moment for global hydrocarbon prices. Oil and gas were now on the up again, with an absolute premium being placed on anyone who could supply oil and gas that wasn't Russian. Algerian government budget revenues took off. At that point, so too did the defence budget. The biggest increase in percentage of GDP terms took place between 2022 and 2023, when you saw that massive spike in prices, and Algerian defence spending jumped from very roughly 4% to north of 7%. As we covered earlier, the successive numbers continue to climb, first to around 8%, and then closer to 9%. So in some ways, you could argue this is a similar story to what we saw much earlier in the 2000s and early 2010s. You have a surge in hydrocarbon revenues, and the government decides to plough that into greater defence spending. That said, economically speaking, I'd argue there's a couple of things that make this a bit different. For one, those increases were coming from a much lower baseline by just about every metric. The defence budget was lower in real terms. It was much lower as a percentage of GDP, and the country's overall debt burden, especially when you're talking about the early 2010s, was much lower than it is now. Make no mistake, as at time of recording, Algeria's overall government debt burden is relatively low by global standards. The most recent figure I've handy is a World Bank estimate for 2025, putting net government debt at around 58% of GDP. In percentage terms, that puts Algeria in roughly the same neighbourhood as countries like Germany, and certainly far, far lower than a lot of the G7 economies, like France and the United States, that have debt to GDP ratios well over 100%. However, there isn't just a but here, there's four. The first is that debt is still much higher now than it was during a lot of that previous modernisation rush. Algeria, for a number of years, was rocking single-digit debt to GDP ratios. The second issue is that while debt might be thoroughly in the manageable range for now, the trajectory is fairly stark. Yes, the oil price was good for a while, but it didn't stay good, and it was never good enough to pay for the increases we saw. Reportedly, according to Algeria's own figures, the country is expecting to run a $40 billion deficit in 2026. Followed by a $39 billion deficit in 2027 and a $42 billion deficit in 2028. As a percentage of projected GDP, that's respectively 12.4%, 11.4%, and another 11.2%. Summation, according to those numbers, the country would be adding 35% debt to GDP in just 3 years. In raw percentage point terms, you could take the US federal government deficit, add it to the French deficit, and you still wouldn't match the deficit that Algeria ran in 2025, and be in the same range as the planned deficits for the next couple of years. Which leads to point 3. The viability of even this being linked very closely to the price of one or two key commodities, mostly oil, and 4, the opportunity cost for a country like Algeria of taking out this kind of debt to spend big on the military being arguably far greater than they would be for some other countries. I'd argue Algeria isn't a country without economic resources, but it is a country with a large number of clashing economic priorities. If you're a state concerned about internal stability, for example, or just want people to have better lives, unemployment can be an issue. And in Algeria, based on International Labour Organization estimates, the general figure there is north of 10%, with the youth unemployment rate pushing uncomfortably close to 30%. And historically, nothing screams counterinsurgency success quite like a bunch of unemployed young fighting-age men running around. There's also a huge imperative to invest in growing and diversifying the Algerian economy so it's less reliant on just hydrocarbons. In that respect, the country's seen some success. Between 2017 and 2023, the country managed to triple its total exports of things that weren't hydrocarbons, which got them to a total of $5.1 billion worth in 2023. That would make non-hydrocarbon exports about 2% of GDP, a drop in the economic bucket even if it is a step in the right direction. Trust me when I understand it can be really, really difficult for a resource-rich country to break its dependency on those resources. It requires a lot of policy focus, a lot of investment, and often a lot of sacrifice. And the concern might be that Algeria is wasting some of its immense economic potential and the window of opportunity it currently has, while the demand for its hydrocarbon resources is still there, to plough those resources into building a much stronger future economy rather than a more powerful conventional military in the short term. Because there is a final asterisk around all of this from an economic perspective that I think is worth noting. In terms of holistic economic costs, not all arms build-ups are created equal. How, where, and what you spend on matters to the point where two nations spending the same amount of money might incur very different holistic economic effects. Germany, for example, you could argue is a case of the stars aligning in terms of reducing the holistic economic cost of rearmament. By international standards, its bond rates are very low, so the government can borrow cheaply to fund the build-up. Its economy is already diversified, a lot of the necessary infrastructure is already in place, and in some case, this investment is going to be using that existing infrastructure, taking over facilities and labour that might be unused by the auto sector, for example, and converting at least some of those over to military production. And then finally, a lot of this new investment that Germany is talking about doing is either going to be done at home or is going to be invested elsewhere in Europe with the expectation that other countries in Europe will also be buying from German manufacturers. When that happens, as we've seen in Russia, that defence spending can become economic stimulus. It can increase industrial activity, lower unemployment. It may not be as efficient as pure civilian investments, like transportation infrastructure, for example, but it can significantly take the edge off the cost of building up your military capability compared to a country that has to bring everything in. Algeria has some domestic capacity. They can modernise and maintain vehicles, they can assemble stuff out of knockdown kits, but a lot of what they buy is coming in from overseas, which means when that tank, that jet, that missile arrives, the money involved isn't being recycled through the economy and partially recouped in taxes from the workers or the companies. It's going somewhere else to pay for someone else's something else. I think that leads to at least three risks from a defence economics perspective that are probably worth discussing here. The first is that it turns out this defence program actually isn't sustainable over the number of years you'd need it to run for, and as a result it has to be downscaled or cut off halfway. What that runs the risk of is things like some of these procurements essentially going off half-cocked. You get part of the way there, start to introduce a couple of Sukhoi 57s, for example, but then you have to start cutting corners, reducing quantities, maybe cutting back on spare parts, training, or the ordnance to support that equipment. If that happens, you may end up paying a lot relative to the amount of capability you end up getting, because you now have a small fleet that has to be maintained without economies of scale that may not have all the capability it should have. This is a phenomenon that can affect defence budgets almost no matter what their overall scale is. Think the United States, for example, that ended up with a truncated fleet of F-22s and B-2s because of the sudden cutback after the fall of the Soviet Union. Those aircraft ended up being far fewer in number, and as a result, harder to maintain and far more expensive on a per-unit basis than they would have been if the entire planned fleet had been produced. If Algeria kicks off some very ambitious procurements and then has to chop them back halfway, they run the risk of falling into the same problem. There may also be the threat of that issue arising, but more on the supply side. If, for example, a nation were to hypothetically build a lot of its military modernisation and sustainment plans off the backs of Russian equipment, and then Russia were to have problems supplying that equipment, be that because of sanctions, the Russian military's own demand, or a tragic smoking accident at one or more of the factories in question, that might potentially be a problem. The second risk has to do with economics and stability, basically the concern that if you dedicate too many resources to the military, you run the risk of not dedicating enough resources to other measures that might, for example, bring down unemployment or increase living standards of the population, which at the extreme might mean that your economic issue becomes at least partly a security issue, which starts to touch on the third risk, which is far more long-term focused, which is the danger that by over-prioritising military rather than economic development over the long term, Algeria finds it economically harder and harder to maintain the level of military superiority or the ratios it wants with other countries in its region. Right now, to be clear, that's not where Algeria is. The economy has continued to grow, foreign reserves are fairly strong, hydrocarbons provide a revenue source, and to consider its primary strategic rival, in raw economic output terms, Algeria continues to have a significant advantage over Morocco. But that debt trajectory is fairly ugly. So unless or until serious things change, like the global oil price or the structure and nature of the Algerian economy and budget, I think the economic and fiscal risks are the ones to keep an eye on as more of this equipment arrives and capability is brought online. History suggests that in some cases it is possible for defence investments to become almost self-defeating, where the economic sacrifices involved cost you more in terms of things like prosperity and internal stability than that additional military capability gives you. Whether Algeria ultimately falls into that situation, though, only time will tell. In conclusion then, looking at this Algerian build-up leaves us with a couple of certainties and a whole bunch of questions. It's clear that Algeria already had one of the best equipped militaries in the region, and that Algiers is willing to attach immense priority to maintaining and building on that edge. It's also clear the country intends to remain a major customer of Russian weapon systems, even as it diversifies to other suppliers like China and Germany. What isn't entirely clear, though, is just how long the Algerian economy will be able to maintain this level of effort, and also how other countries in the region might choose to respond. On that latter question, from countries like Morocco, we already have a couple of clues. But ultimately, I think, that's a question for another episode. And alright, brief channel update to close out. Firstly, thanks to the patrons who voted for this topic. I've wanted to do an episode on an African country for a very long time now, and so seeing the recent poll go the way it went was ultimately a great surprise. The natural challenge with these kind of videos, though, is that, quite deliberately, you end up very focused on the nation in question, which means in order to get a fuller understanding of the regional environment, you might have to look at multiple nations in turn. Having done this video then, I think it's almost guaranteed that we get a video on the Kingdom of Morocco in the future, although I haven't set a target release date for that one yet. Beyond that, quick apologies for some of the sound issues last week. My equipment was playing up, so I've gone back to previous tech for this week. Hopefully it came through better. I've also started making some other changes on the tech and YouTube side, but in the interest of time, I might go through some of those next week. For the moment, thank you all of you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and with any luck, I'll see you all again next week.